Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 737 for November 1st, 2018. Coming up in just a few minutes.
We've got so much to offer in terms of provenance and place. We're a day's drive from nearly 90% of red wine production. All of the malted barley's grown within a day's drive of the distillery. And that climate, we're famous for our 4 seasons in a day. It really gives us an opportunity to take advantage of maturation and mellow the whiskey out in a shorter period of time.
David Vitale isn't your typical Australian whiskey maker. Instead of settling in Tasmania, the center of Australia's growing whiskey industry, he set up the original Starward distillery in an old hangar at the Melbourne airport. His flight plan has taken a few twists and turns since then, and we'll talk with David Vitale later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and more, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
This is Whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's start with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. If you listened to the last episode, we reported that the Scotch whisky industry was a bit pessimistic in its hopes for UK Chancellor Philip Hammond's budget address Monday. The Scotch Whisky Association had been leading an effort to persuade Hammond to extend the current tax freeze on whiskies and other spirits in the UK's next budget. However, it's a good thing you probably did not take that outlook to the betting window, because Hammond had a surprise in store when he addressed the House of Commons Monday.
And in response to the concerted lobbying of my Scottish Conservative colleagues, I will also freeze duty on spirits so that we can all afford to raise a wee dram to Ruth Davidson on the arrival of baby Finn. Saving 2p on a pint of beer, 1p on a pint of cider and 30p on a bottle of scotch or gin compared to the inflation assumption in the OBR forecast.
While the freeze came as a pleasant surprise, the Scotch Whisky Association's Graham Littlejohn says there's still a lot more work left to do.
That doesn't change the fact that still £3 in every £4 spent on your average price bottle of Scotch whisky in the UK goes directly to the Chancellor and the Treasury in taxation through both duty and VAT. That's something we want to address in the long term. Now, we're always looking to the next budget, but we realise that it becomes more difficult year on year to ask for freezes and cuts. So what we were asking for, and what we've asked for the last few years now, we reiterated it in our statement, as you saw, that we want to have an open-minded, detailed discussion with Treasury about how we reform taxation of alcohol in the UK. Mark, there's a great disparity between different alcohol categories in the UK: beer, cider, wine, and spirits. Spirits is taxed higher per unit of alcohol than any other category. We want to try and address that, and we think we need to have that detailed conversation with the Treasury outside of budget periods, because you're never going to be able to do that when you're focused on a fiscal event. We have to do that over the course of the end of the autumn, over the winter and into the spring. So by the time we get to this time next year, we're not having the same old conversation about freezes and cuts, but rather we're having a more grown-up conversation about exactly how we tax alcohol.
In addition to the freeze on spirits duties, Hammond also froze them for beer. But wine taxes will go up by more than 3%, in line with inflation, when the new budget takes effect. In other news, there's a new report out projecting long-term growth for whiskey sales worldwide. The Global International Whiskies Insights 2018 report released Thursday by the IWSR and JustDrinks.com, shows worldwide sales of non-Scotch whiskies rose by 2.3% last year. The report projects further growth over the next 5 years, especially for whiskies from the U.S., Ireland, Japan, and India, with limits on supplies likely to be the only thing that holds the industry back. Last time around, we mentioned that the Last Drop Distillers would be unveiling its first-ever bourbon this week in collaboration with Sazerac, which acquired the London-based company last year. We now have the details. It's a 20-year-old bourbon that was distilled back in 1982 when Buffalo Trace was known as the George T. Stagg Distillery. Of course, 1982 is a lot longer than 20 years ago. That barrel was emptied into a stainless steel tank in 2002, sealed, and left to rest until now. Only 44 bottles will be available at $4,000 each. The U.S. will get 25 of them, while the rest will go to retailers in Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, Johnnie Walker has unveiled the 5th and final edition in the John Walker & Sons Private Collection range. The Midnight Blend is 28 years old. Just 3,888 numbered decanters will be available worldwide. The recommended retail price, $750 each. And speaking of blending, Chivas is releasing a special blending kit just in time for the holidays. It includes 50 cl bottles of 4 different single malts and a single grain whiskey, along with that all-important pipette and beaker to create your bespoke blend, and an empty bottle to pour it into. There's also a 50 cl bottle of Chivas Regal 12-year-old to compare your blend with the one created by master blender Colin Scott and his team in Scotland. The kit will be available worldwide. Pricing will vary by market. Let's give a shout-out to the folks at Sonny Malloy's Bar in Galway, Ireland. They were able to convince Irish distillers to not only let them have a single-cask redbreast bottling, but a 16-year-old single cask to boot. It's apparently the first time Redbreast has bottled a single cask for a bar. It'll be available later this month exclusively at the bar in Galway. No word on pricing. And it looks like I'm just going to have to head over to Ireland now. Of course, we should note that Redbreast is a sponsor of WhiskyCast. And finally, back in 2016, we reported that Hockey Hall of Fame goalie Ed Belfour was planning to get into the whiskey business with his son Dane and was auctioning off most of his hockey memorabilia to fund the project. Hadn't heard much else since then until Scott Burnside caught up with the Belfours and wrote a story on their project for theathletic.com. Dane Belfour spent some of the time since then interning at Woody Creek Distillers in Colorado, and they've been working with a distillery in North Carolina to lay down stocks of both rye and bourbon. The plans are to start selling both whiskeys next summer in the Dallas area. Still no word on what they plan to call it. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking Soul. It's time to start figuring out where you'll be during the holidays. And if you're going to be visiting friends or family, there's no better gift to bring along than a bottle of Highland Park. Look for the new Valknut single malt from the Viking series. It's available now at most good whiskey shops, and you can check out the entire range at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Whiskey Jubilee Chicago is next Thursday night, November 8th. Our friends Billy Layton and David McCabe from Middleton Distillery in Ireland will be leading a special tasting next Friday night at Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts. Glasgow's Whiskey Festival is next Saturday, November 10th at Hampton Park in Glasgow, Scotland. And that same day is the Red, White, and Bourbon benefit for the National Museum of the Pacific War at Garrison Brothers Distillery in High, Texas. Tickets are still available for the New Brunswick Spirits Festival in Fredericton, New Brunswick. It's November 13th through the 17th, and I hope you'll join us for special coverage from Fredericton that week right here on WhiskyCast. The Whiskey Extravaganza is November 16th in Los Angeles, and the Virginia Craft Spirits Roadshow that was scheduled for last month and postponed by Hurricane Florence has been rescheduled for November 17th at the A. Smith Bowman Distillery in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Finally, Whiskey Live Dublin is the week of November 23rd and 24th in Ireland. Right now, we have 139 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just use the search button to find one near you or wherever you're traveling.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. To infinity and beyond. Of course, that's Buzz Lightyear's catchphrase from the Toy Story movies, but it could also describe the Starward Distillery in Melbourne, Australia. David Vitale founded Starward in an old airplane hangar at the Melbourne airport, well away from the center of Australia's growing whiskey industry in Tasmania. But, as he told me recently during a visit to New York, Starward's origin story started out in Tasmania.
Let's talk about your entry into the U.S. market first, because I don't think a lot of folks realize that we now have more than one Australian whiskey available in the United States.
It's really exciting. This is something that we've been working on for about 11 years as a distillery, and always had the US in mind. My wife's actually American, so one of the ways of keeping my mother-in-law happy will be to kind of establish the brand here, and ideally in the new year move over and permanently base the family and myself here to build the brand. So it's very exciting.
What's the potential for growth over here? Because I've been saying for a few years that if people start taking Australian whiskey as seriously as they take Australian wines, this could really take off as a key market for you.
I'm so excited about the opportunity, and one of the things I guess that's held us back for a while now has been the scope of the market and the scale at which we could kind of take advantage of the opportunity. And I think that the wine story is a great comparison to the Australian whiskey story. It's quite distinctive in character. It's a modern take on a tradition. It's very much talking to the place it's made. So there's great comparisons between the two, and certainly with Starward maturing, all of our whiskey and wine barrels kind of is part of that story.
And the story is also a bit different because we think of Australian whiskey as mostly coming from Tasmania and all the distilleries down on that island, but you guys are up in Melbourne.
Yeah, and I'm Melbourne born and bred, but actually learnt how to make whiskey with Bill Lark at Lark Distillery, which was quite an honour and a privilege, but always loved my hometown, and figured that, we've got so much to offer in terms of provenance and place. We're a day's drive from nearly 90% of red wine production. All of the malted barley's grown within a day's drive of the distillery. And that climate, we're famous for our 4 seasons in a day. It really gives us an opportunity to take advantage of maturation and mellow the whiskey out in a shorter period of time.
Let's explain those climate differences between Tasmania and the Melbourne area.
Yes, so Tasmania is quite temperate. It does have warm summers, but very, very infrequent would be the description there. So far more Pacific Northwest style of climate. and humid, whereas Melbourne really does, in the heights of summer, we can get huge temperature ranges of up to 22, 23 degrees Fahrenheit a day. And that's quite a substantial kind of variation in temperature, which means that whiskey's always working. I kind of think of them as the hardest working barrels in the world, as opposed to just resting and mellowing over time.
How did you decide to get into distilling in the first place? And then tell me how you wound up working with Bill Lark.
Yeah, it's a great story. So actually, I went down to Tasmania on a bit of a whim with my wife at the time, and was going to set up an organic microbrewery of all things. But thinking about how big that could become and exporting a beer, I kind of quickly realised that good beer doesn't travel well. And I was talking to a mutual contact about this idea of a microbrewery that could travel well. And he said, I think I've got someone that might be able to solve that problem for you. And so I caught up with Bill, and it was a bit of a ruse. They both kind of connected and said, don't tell him what you do. And I caught up with Bill in a cafe, and which is actually the distillery on the waterfront. And I opened the door there, and it was all in front of me, this my future, basically, because obviously all great whiskies share a lot in common with craft beer. They are taking a malted barley, typically, interesting characteristics for malted barley, fermenting them, and, we use a brewing strain as well as a distilling strain, and then talking to the place it's made, which is, and different styles. So by the time that I met Bill, really, my knowledge was far deeper into craft beer than it was craft whiskey. So I was fascinated by this world of single malt whiskies, which I hadn't even heard of before, and could join the dots between all of these single malts and the way that they kind of tell their stories about flavour and place, and the way that a lot of craft breweries do the same thing. So I was, I guess, a craft beer drinker and maker, a home brewer, that could kind of identify those similarities in whiskey.
And that prompted you to start Starward?
Not quite. It was one of those things. Yeah. It was. That was the first point. But I think what really got me excited was this idea that, the craft beer scene, even in Australia in the early noughties, in the early 2000s, was very small. I mean, it had some legs to run on it. But this seemed to me like the craft whiskey scene seemed to me like it was at 1985 by comparison to where craft beer was, and that we had a real opportunity to create something that was distinctly Australian and that we could take to the world. And I guess the Melbourne piece in that was, why don't we think about sourcing these wine barrels that are so close to home and maturing in that and occupying the sharing cabinet with a great Australian whiskey.
What did the winemakers tell you at first when you said, we want to use your barrels for whiskey?
They were quite curious, because I think the notion for them was that typically it's fortified wine that's recoopered and charred, and what we wanted to do was basically source those barrels still wet and fill them directly with new make spirit. And so they kind of scratched their heads. Mostly they were really excited by the barrels having another use, because typically in Australia, after a barrel's been used at a winery, it ends up going to a garden nursery as a planter box for a lemon tree or something. So they were really excited by the fact that we were, exploring flavour and really starting to put some value back into that. And we've effectively created a secondary market for those barrels, which is great.
What have you found in terms of Australian wines works best with your whiskies? I know you've done some experimenting with the Australian equivalent of sherry that they can't call sherry over there, but what works best with your whiskies?
We love big Australian reds. I think the benefit there is that the wood policy that winemakers use to create big Australian reds is a mixture of French and American oak barrels. And so depending on the winemaker and the winery, we'll basically source a mixture of both of those varietals, both of those types of oak styles, and then marry them together at the distillery after maturation. So typically Cabernet and Shiraz.
And then this sherry style, tell me about that.
Yeah, so the Australian equivalent of sherry is called a Pera, which is quite a distinctive style. I think when we think of sherry cask whiskies, it's Christmas, right? English pudding, dessert, dark dried fruits, and I think we're still in the Christmas area, but a lot brighter characteristics, bright dried fruits, so more dried apricots and peaches, lots of candied kind of characteristics coming through as well, so more Italian panettone instead of the English pudding equivalent. So it's a lovely style. Unfortunately, not a lot of it's being consumed now. I mean, it's to our benefit. They're disgorging these barrels and then selling them on. Sometimes they're 40 to 50 years of age when we get them. But we're really fortunate to have a deep inventory of that whiskey that we hopefully will see us through.
Now, you originally started the distillery out near the Melbourne airport, right? In a hangar, I think, if I remember the story correctly, right?
Right, yeah. So we were in an old Quantas maintenance hangar for the first 5 years of our whiskey lives, and outgrew that space and then took the advantage to move closer to the city of Melbourne. So we've got 4,000 square metres. I'm trying to do the maths. It's just under an acre of warehouse space that we do everything from barley to maturation, packaging, and have a fully fledged bar at the distillery. So quite a lovely gift to the city of Melbourne is amazing whiskey distillery with a purpose-built bar in it.
I find it hard to imagine running out of space in an airplane hangar as big as those things are, but I guess you run out of ground space, but you could probably go up, right?
Yeah, so we kind of tossed up what we were going to do next, and one of the things that we considered was staying in the space and racking higher, or alternatively finding other sites close by that we would just use as storage. But we loved the idea of keeping a very close eye on our inventory, learning about it. We're still quite young. There's lots to learn and discover about how whiskey matures over time, and so we figured that having those barrels close to us was important. And, you know, as much as I love our home place and it's an important part of the whole brand story, really being close to bars and retailers was important for us in terms of making sure that we were delivering something that, you know, met their needs as well.
So what's the best piece of advice Bill Lark gave you as you were getting started?
Well, he thought I was crazy when we first started in terms of, for lots of, I think we're all crazy, right, getting into the whiskey game. But his big caution was don't price your product too cheaply because it could eventually devalue it. I think that was one of his first bits of advice, is to, you know, not undervalue the product. And it's been something that's always stuck with me. I think from my point of view, we wanted to really target the everyday drinking market as opposed to the special occasion cabinet, which we all have. Mine's jammed packed, but I don't think there'll be enough whiskey days in my life to drink all of that special occasion cabinet. So we wanted something in the sharing cabinet that we can share with friends all the time.
So what expressions do you have in the U.S. right now, and then what else are you selling around the world? Because I know you're in Europe as well.
So in the U.S. at the moment we have Nova, which is matured entirely in red wine barrels from the day it's made. In the new year, Solera, our fortified expression using Apera barrels, will come into market, and they're the same two products that we sell in Australia and London.
So what's the biggest mistake you made in those first 5 years?
I mean, the general answer any distiller will tell you is not making enough. That's kind of the default, I guess. I think the biggest mistake I made was probably not thinking about the financial aspect of setting up a distillery. Like there's a big, we focused on solely being a single malt whiskey distillery, something that, you know, we didn't go into the gin game or other liqueurs or anything like that. It was just focused on making a whiskey, and that was that. That's what got me out of bed every day. But the complication with that, certainly in those early years, is that you don't have any cash flow. So you imagine you can stretch the dollar further than you can. And that nearly caught us out. So we were kind of hanging on by the whites of our fingernails for a period of time. But we're able to kind of see that through. So the standard advice is, you know, identify how much you need, add a margin of safety, and then double it. And that's probably about right in terms of what you need to set up a distillery.
It's no secret that Starward has taken on an investment from Distilled Ventures, part of Diageo, as Westward has, as we've reported. Did that help get you through those lean times, and what did that bring to Starward?
It certainly did, and I think obviously the capital's a really important part, but what it also provided was some focus, because a lot of the time any startup, whether it's a distillery or a tech firm, are often worrying about how am I going to meet payroll, what's the least worst decision I can make here given the constraint of capital. And very quickly that turns around to saying, okay, well, not that it's an open checkbook, but now we can make deliberate decisions that are in the interests of the whiskey as opposed to kind of what we can make do with at this particular point in time. So it helps you focus on the bigger, more important decisions with some clarity about outcome, as opposed to necessity, in that first moment. But I think the other thing that we've certainly benefited from is the relationship with other distilleries that we can talk to and share stories about, both in terms of route to market and understanding what we can do to build the brand together, and also collaborations in terms of barrel expressions. I'm actually, myself and the CEO of Starward are going over to Stauning Distillery to check out their new distillery and explore that, and also just have a sounding board for support on new ideas and ways to build and scale up.
Now, there's a pattern developing here between Starward, Westward, and Stauning. One of these three does not sound like the other. You guys going to force him to go to like Stownward or something like that?
Yeah, well, or maybe we're just trying to work out what we've got to do there to get the team in Denmark to change their names, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
There is one other Starward release in addition to the Nova and Solera single malts, the twofold double grain whiskey that's made with both malted barley and wheat. But as of now, it's not available outside of Australia. Thanks to Starward's David Vitale for spending some time with us on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic Lagavulin 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition, the Throwback 8-year-old, and this year's annual release of the cask strength 12-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, and let's start off with the Starward Solera. It's bottled at 43% ABV, and as David Vitale told us, it's matured in recoopered Apera fortified wine barrels. The nose has a nice balance of baking spices, baked apples and cherries, a hint of apricots, and touches of honey and vanilla. The taste is spicy and fruity with clove, allspice, white pepper, red apples, apricots, and hints of citrus, honey, and toasted coconut. The finish fades away slowly with a nice spiciness and hints of dried fruits. I'm scoring the Starward Solera Australian single malt a 92, and you'll find my tasting notes for the Starward Nova at the WhiskyCast website. Last month, we took a tour of the new Old Forester Distillery in Louisville, just as they were bottling the final edition in Old Forester's Whiskey Row series. You can listen to that tour in episode 732, but I received a sample of the Old Forester 1910 Old Fine Whiskey the other day. It recreates what may have been one of the earlier attempts to double mature a whiskey. Back in 1910, after a fire-halted bottling, the whiskey that was ready to be bottled was put back into barrels while the bottling line was being fixed, and that whiskey was later described as, quote, Old Fine Whiskey. That's where the name comes from. And like that whiskey from 108 years ago, this bourbon was put into a second barrel at 50% ABV and later bottled at 46.5% ABV. The nose is aromatic with touches of caramel, butterscotch, apricots, toffee, soft spices, and just a touch of pencil shavings. The spices build up nicely on the palate, along with hints of raisins, brown sugar, caramel corn, and a hint of cinnamon leading into the finish. that turns into a lingering hint of cinnamon raisin bread, along with touches of caramel and campfire smoke. I'm scoring the Old Forester 1910 Old Fine Whiskey a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, family-owned from the start, and proud to work with other family-owned companies on the Grain to Glass project. They're working with Beck's Hybrid and Peterson Farms to find unique seeds, grow them, and then distill them into a special whiskey. Follow the project at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. We mentioned the new Lafroig 28-year-old Islay single malt during the news a couple of weeks ago, and the Whiskey Ferry delivered a small sample the other day. It's bottled at 41.7% ABV, and the nose is full of grilled fruits, along with a good smokiness, and touches of heather, creosote, oak, burnt caramel, and creme brulee. The taste is smoky and spicy, sort of like good dry rub barbecue, along with honey, caramel, oak, and heather. The finish is long with a subtle smokiness and hints of grilled fruits, caramel, and honey. I'm scoring the Lafroig 28-year-old a 92. Finally, I got the chance to taste the Balvenie's new 25-year-old Doublewood the other day. It's a special edition bottled for the Doublewood's 25th anniversary, and like the standard Balvenie 12-year-old Doublewood, it spent most of its time in American oak barrels, with just a few months in Oloroso sherry casks. It's bottled at 43% ABV, and the nose has notes of gingerbread, molasses, orange marmalade, and hints of allspice and honey. Most of all, there's no sign of oakiness despite the age. The taste? It's full of spices, with clove, allspice, white pepper, and a hint of ginger root, balanced nicely by vanilla, fresh berries, and ripe currants. It only needs a drop or two of water to open up more floral and toffee notes, along with even more fruitiness. The finish is long and subtle. It fades away gently with a touch of oak. It's another David Stewart classic, and I'm scoring the Balvenie Doublewood 25-year-old a 95. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,300 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at whiskycast.com.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're alright, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Ella.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whisky. 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Got this comment from longtime listener Omar Fitzell in Cork, Ireland, after our last episode and the interview with the outspoken Louise McGuane of Chapelgate Whiskey Company. Here's what Omar said on Twitter. Great episode of WhiskyCast this week. Love the "you don't hold back" from Mark while chatting to Louise McGuane of at Whiskygate. Understatement of the year in a good way. Can't wait to try the new Flintlock whiskey. Will it be at Whiskey Live Dublin, I wonder? Well, Louise saw that post and confirmed that it will be poured at Whisky Live Dublin later this month, though she added that you will have to listen to her lecture on transparency before you get to try it. Without getting into details, let's just say that she's not a big fan of the limits in European law on disclosing the ages of various whiskies in a blend. Last time around, we also mentioned the high-tech decanter that Rebecca Jago and the team at the Last Drop Distillers had created for their Tom's Blend No. 1 to use at special events, and we posted a video of this decanter on the WhiskyCast website and on our social media feeds. Mark Pagani of New Orleans posted this on our Facebook page. I'm immediately suspicious of stuff like this. The sentence in my head goes like this. I assume their whiskey must not be interesting enough in its own right. They need a gimmick. That is, of course, met with my ever-present love of cool and good design. The two sides are having a fight in my mind right now. I know what you're thinking, Mark, and usually something like this would have me at least thinking that for a second. But in this case, the whiskey is even better than the decanter's design. It's just a shame that Tom's Blend No. 1 will never go on sale. Last week we mentioned the J.P. Weiser's Alumni Series of Canadian whiskies, featuring 3 of the NHL's legendary players to raise money for the NHL Alumni Program that helps retired players in need. I posted the label for the Lanny McDonald bottle on Twitter the other night, with the comment that it mentions, quote, 2 of 6 alumni, even though only the bottles for McDonald, Guy Lafleur, and Wendell Clark have been released so far, with a question, what's that all about? According to our good friend and expert on all things Canadian whiskey, Davin DeCurgamo, at Davin DeK on Twitter, there are 3 more coming in the spring, just in time for the Stanley Cup playoffs, I would think. We don't know yet which players will be honored, but I'm sure Dr. Don Livermore at Corby will share details on that second line when he can. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always track us down online. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at WhiskyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. With the weather getting colder now in the Northern Hemisphere, you may find yourself just like me, getting the sniffles every now and then, maybe even a full-blown cold. Whiskey blenders depend on their noses even more than the rest of us, so how do they handle it when they get a stuffy nose? I put that question to Dewar's master blender, Stephanie McLeod.
Well, luckily, we don't just rely on the master blender myself. I have trained over the years a number of people who are part of our sensory group. So that means that if I'm on holiday, which I do take holidays, or if I have the cold, then there are always people around me who are also able to nose the spirits. So if I'm required to take an important decision on a spirit and I know that I've got the cold, then I will defer that until I'm absolutely fighting fit. But for all of our other brands and samples, then we have a nosing panel, and they're selected on the basis of their ability to nose all of our products. And then we have a category of what we call super nosers. So these are people who are particularly able to detect particularly off odours at very low levels. And so these people will be called upon if we think that we have perhaps an issue with a product. Thankfully, that doesn't happen very often, but there are certain aromas that can occur in whiskey, and we want to be ready for them should they ever occur.
But what happens when the cold goes through the entire team? As things often do, somebody's kid brings home a cold from school or brings home a flu bug and the entire team is down. What happens then?
Well, the world stops turning then, doesn't it? No, that's never happened. We never have a complete wipeout of the factory. If that happened, then we wouldn't be producing whiskey. So
it's a good thing Stephanie's nose was clear when they opened up that cask of Craigellachie 51-year-old we mentioned in the news last time around. Dewar's is giving away all of the whiskey from that cask at a series of free tastings in pop-up bars starting at the end of this month in London at Milroy's of Soho. 150 free tickets are available for those tastings, but you have to sign up at the Craigellachie website by November 15th to be eligible. Thanks to Stephanie McLeod of Dewar's for helping us out on Behind the Label. And if there's a question you'd like us to look into, just use the contact form at whiskeycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskeycast.com, along with links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, events, tasting notes, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes going back to 2005. We're about to celebrate another anniversary in just a couple of weeks. Please share WhiskyCast with your friends this week. Tell them about the show if they're a whiskey lover, and if they're not familiar with podcasts, show them how to use that podcast app that's just sitting there on their smartphone so they can discover a whole world of free content out there. While you're at it, please leave a review or rating for WhiskyCast wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. The email address is comments@whiskeycast.com, and you'll also find us on social media. Look for us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is Whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky. From this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice each week, usually from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.